By the spring of 1864, the Northern public was exhausted, and they demanded a decisive confrontation between the war's most famous generals. The stage was set in the Eastern Theater, the tightly contested geographic corridor stretching between the capital cities of Washington and Richmond. Defending that corridor was General Robert E. Lee. Lee operated on a traditional Napoleonic military doctrine. He relied on what he called headwork, personally scouting topography to devise highly imaginative, audacious tactical maneuvers. His objective was to deliver a massive strike against a weak point, aiming to shatter the enemy's morale in a single afternoon. A distinctly different approach was brought to the East by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant relied on a modern doctrine of continuous pressure and simultaneous advances across multiple fronts. This strategy is known as system-wide attrition, the deliberate pragmatic grinding down of an opponent's personnel and resources over time until they lose the physical capacity to wage war. When these two opposing philosophies collided, the result was the Overland Campaign. The Overland Campaign was an uninterrupted series of bloody battles fought across Virginia over 6 grueling weeks. It broke from the previous rhythm of the Civil War, offering no pauses to rest, refit, or retreat. This campaign would ultimately be decided by a different metric than tactical brilliance on a map. Success would hinge on which commander's physical and psychological resilience broke first under the crushing weight of command. On May 6th, the second day of the campaign, Grant's army found itself trapped in the wilderness. The wilderness was a massive, dense, second-growth forest in central Virginia. The thick brush reduced combat to close-quarters brawls with near-zero visibility, neutralizing traditional infantry and artillery tactics. Chaos reigned. Confederate assaults violently drove in both flanks of the Army of the Potomac, the principal Union military force in the East. As casualty numbers spiked, deep panic set in among the Union officer corps. With his 1864 strategy hanging by a thread, Grant retreated into the absolute privacy of his tent. For what a staff officer later called an unpleasant 10 or 15 minutes, Grant wrestled with the abyss of failure. He was alone with the realization that a massive defeat might end the Northern War effort. Previous Union commanders had faced similar crises in Virginia. Every single one of them had responded by accepting defeat, pulling their troops back across a river, and retreating to the safety of Washington to regroup. Grant stepped out of his tent and issued his orders. He directed his army to march south toward Spotsylvania. They would not retreat. They would continue the advance. Grant's psychological triumph over the fear of failure turned the conflict from a series of isolated battles into an inescapable pressure system. From that night onward, Lee would never again have a moment to breathe. By late May, Grant's relentless pace had pushed the armies to the banks of the North Anna River. The constant, unyielding forward momentum had physically exhausted Lee and his army. This topographical diagram illustrates Lee's brilliant ad hoc adaptation to the terrain. Anticipating Grant's aggressive pursuit, Lee designed a defensive earthwork in the shape of an inverted V, anchoring its apex securely on the high banks of the river. This geometry forced the advancing Union army to split in two. To reinforce one wing, troops had to cross the river, march around the point of the V, and cross the river a second time. Lee finally had his opportunity to destroy an isolated half of the Federal Army. But the trap exposed a fatal vulnerability in Lee's highly centralized command structure. His doctrine relied on trusted, brilliant subordinates to execute complex maneuvers. Now General James Longstreet was severely wounded, J.B. Stuart was dead, and his remaining corps commanders were incapacitated by illness or completely exhausted. Simultaneously, Lee suffered a sudden, debilitating physical breakdown. He was struck by severe heart issues and dysentery, an intestinal infection causing extreme dehydration and weakness. The Confederate commander was confined to a cot in his tent, bedridden. Lying in his tent, listening to the opportunity slip away, Lee grew frustrated. He lamented to his aides, "We must strike them a blow. We must never let them pass again. We must strike them a blow." But without Lee physically in the saddle to lead the assault, his subordinates were paralyzed. The trap never sprung. Lee's tactical masterpiece failed because his personality-driven command system lacked the structural resilience to function the moment its leader collapsed. This animation shows Grant's response once he realized the danger. He extracted his split wings, crossed the river, and slid southeast around Lee's flank, bypassing the Confederate works to continue his march toward Richmond. Grant's decentralized pragmatic system was designed for durability. It absorbed tactical beatings, horrific casualties, and constant friction, yet it maintained forward momentum. If one general faltered, the machine kept moving. Conversely, the Army of Northern Virginia lost its offensive capability at the North Anna River. When Lee's health forced him out of the field, his army's ability to maneuver and strike vanished with him. Grant eventually forced Lee into a static defensive siege at Petersburg. Petersburg was a critical rail and supply hub just south of Richmond. By pinning the Confederate Army in trenches there, Grant effectively stripped Lee of his ability to wage a mobile war. Lee's headwork and tactical imagination won individual engagements. He inflicted damage and laid brilliant traps. But Grant's structural system was winning the broader war of attrition, grinding down the opposition until resistance became mathematically impossible. Winning a modern, high-stakes crisis requires an organizational system capable of surviving the crushing loneliness of command.